Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into the warm, sun-drenched world of ancient Egypt, where the aroma of fresh bread wafts softly through mud brick villages beside the Nile. Imagine yourself trudging through a bustling marketplace, the ground dusty beneath your sandals, the hum of quiet chatter floating on the hot breeze. You might be tempted to think ancient life was all pharaohs and pyramids, but really it revolved around simpler pleasures like bread. That daily staple baked with care and tradition was as essential as water or sunlight. And if you think you could handle baking sourdough the old-fashioned way, well, you probably won't survive this. No fancy mixers, no temperature controls, just patient skill, and some stubborn wild yeast. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is locally. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Bread was the backbone of ancient Egyptian life, not just food, but a daily ritual threaded through every corner of society. Imagine waking up before dawn, the horizon a soft orange glow, and knowing that your day will begin with grinding grain and coaxing a living starter into life. Sourdough, unlike modern industrial bread, depended entirely on wild yeasts and bacteria, drifting lazily in the warm Egyptian air, captured carefully by bakers who treated their starters almost like pets. Unlike today's instant yeasts that promise quick rise and fluff, ancient sourdough rose slowly, patiently, a process that echoes the slow pace of life by the river itself. This bread wasn't just a convenience, it was survival. Grain was precious, cultivated with skill along the Nile's fertile banks, and baked bread was a portable, energy-rich food that could sustain workers through long, laborious days. You might picture the smell of freshly baked loaves being as comforting then, as it is now, a reminder that life even thousands of years ago had its small, sweet rituals. Historians still argue whether the earliest Egyptian breads used sourdough starters similar to today's, or if they started with more spontaneous fermentations, but one thing's clear: the slow, gentle art of bread making was central. And while you imagine this, remember the daily rhythm of grinding, mixing, and baking was punctuated by a sense of community and care. It wasn't just sustenance, it was a quietly sacred act, a connection to the land, the water, and to each other. So as you settle in, imagine those early bakers, their hands dusted with flour, kneading dough with a patience that might make you yawn in sympathy. But that patience, that slow pace, is exactly what made their bread and their world so enduring. Close your eyes and picture the lush banks of the Nile where the fields stretch wide under an endless blue sky. Here, the ancient Egyptians harvested the very grains that would soon be ground into flour for their daily bread. It's easy to think wheat and barley were just ordinary crops, but the specific varieties grown here had unique qualities, shaped by the fertile soil and gentle flooding cycles of the Nile. These seasonal floods replenished nutrients and made the land incredibly rich, perfect for growing grains that were the lifeblood of the community. You might imagine these grains as humble seeds, but to the Egyptians they were precious treasures. Barley, in particular, was a staple favored for its resilience and slightly sweet flavor. It was often mixed with emmer wheat, a now rare ancestor of modern wheat, to make bread that was hearty and filling. And here's a quirky tidbit: some scholars suggest the grains themselves may have carried natural yeasts on their husks, helping to jumpstart fermentation when mixed with water. So the starter cultures were in a way gifts from the grains themselves, living alongside the flour like tiny invisible partners in baking. Water, too, played a special role. The Nile's slow, steady flow not only fed the crops but provided the soft, mineral-rich water essential for mixing dough. Bakers might have noticed subtle differences when using water from various parts of the river, much like today's bakers talk about the terroir of their ingredients. It's fascinating to consider that the qualities of the river could subtly influence the flavor and texture of bread. Historians still argue whether Egyptians deliberately chose water sources for this reason, or if it was simply a happy accident of geography. And then there were the wild yeasts and bacteria that floated invisibly in the air, waiting to be captured by patient bakers. Unlike modern controlled fermentations, sourdough starters back then were living, breathing cultures nurtured with daily feedings and care. Bakers often kept starters in special containers, sometimes ceramic jars or woven baskets lined with cloth to protect and cultivate the delicate ecosystem of microbes. Some evidence even suggests these starters were shared or gifted among bakers, creating a quiet community of bread lovers connected by their unique sourdough cultures. You might find it amusing to think about ancient Egyptians treating their starters almost like pets, feeding them regularly, coaxing them to life with gentle hands and guarding them against contamination. It's a surprisingly tender relationship, considering it's all about a simple dough. But there's a slow, satisfying rhythm in this care that echoes the flow of the Nile itself, steady, nurturing, and quietly persistent. You follow the trail from field to mill, where the grains meet their transformation into flour, a humble alchemy powered by human hands and simple tools. In ancient Egypt, grinding grain was a rhythmic communal task often undertaken by women sitting on low stools or the ground rubbing two stones together with practiced ease. The lower stone was flat and stable, while the upper handheld stone rocked back and forth, crushing the kernels into finer and finer particles. Imagine the steady, almost hypnotic sound of grinding, a soft whisper against the backdrop of village life where chatter and children's laughter mingle with the grind. This milling wasn't quick by any modern standard. It demanded patience and endurance, and the result was a coarse flour quite different from the silky white we're used to today. The texture, slightly gritty and uneven, gave the bread a hearty rustic character, an earthy crunch that would surprise modern palates. Historians still argue whether the milling process was optimized for finer flour in royal bakeries, or if most people stuck with this coarser, nourishing style. The physical effort involved in milling connected bakers deeply with their food. Some archaeological finds show that millstones were large and heavy, sometimes passed down as family heirlooms, their surfaces worn smooth by generations of grinding. These stones were often made from basalt or sandstone materials chosen for their durability. In some cases, communal mills powered by donkeys or oxen began to appear, slowly easing the burden but still requiring careful tending. Interestingly, there's evidence that grinding grain also had a subtle social aspect. Women might gather in groups to grind together, exchanging stories and advice, making the labor less monotonous and more of a shared experience. This collective effort blended necessity with companionship, turning a repetitive chore into a gentle bonding ritual. Of course, the final flour wasn't the only product of grinding. The coarse bran left behind was often repurposed, mixed into animal feed, or used in other household tasks, making sure nothing went to waste. This thrifty use of every grain part reflects the ancient Egyptians' deep respect for the resources given by the land and river. You might smile at the thought of these hard-working bakers, their hands rough and flour-dusted, keeping rhythm with the stones, while nearby a child plays with a clay doll or a simple wooden toy. It's a vivid reminder that behind every loaf was a rich tapestry of daily life, labor, and quiet care. As the coarse flour settles, your thoughts turn to the heart of the sourdough process, the starter. This living mixture of wild yeast and bacteria was the mysterious vital spark that transformed simple dough into a loaf with life and character. You probably wouldn't expect bakers from thousands of years ago to have scientific understanding of microorganisms, but they had practical knowledge refined through generations. Treat your starter well, and it will reward you with airiness and flavor. Neglect it, and your bread would be as flat as the desert floor. Bakers nurtured starters with a ritualistic patience. They often kept a portion of the previous day's dough aside, allowing it to ferment slowly overnight before mixing it into the next batch. This method passed on the yeast culture, a practice that closely mirrors modern sourdough techniques. There's something oddly tender about this. Imagine a baker cradling a sticky, bubbling jar of dough, whispering encouragements, or perhaps simply marveling at the invisible life within. Quirky customs surrounded the starter's care. Some texts hint that bakers might have offered small portions of starter to gods or ancestors, seeing it as a sacred life force worth honoring. Others suggest that starters were considered family heirlooms passed down through generations, much like prized recipes or cherished tools. It's a beautiful thought that something as humble as fermented dough could carry such meaning and continuity. Historians still argue whether ancient bakers understood the microbial nature of starters, or if they attributed the fermentation to divine intervention or natural magic. Regardless, they treated the starter with great respect, guarding it against contamination by dust or unwanted bacteria. Starter containers ranged from simple clay pots to woven baskets lined with cloth, all designed to maintain the delicate environment needed for fermentation. Another fascinating detail, some starters might have varied significantly by region, or even by household, giving rise to distinct local bread flavors. This subtle diversity makes you realize that ancient Egyptian bread was far from uniform. It was a living, evolving tradition shaped by microclimates, ingredients, and the personalities of bakers themselves. So as you picture these bakers tending their starters, remember the quiet miracle happening in their hands, a tiny ecosystem thriving, giving life to bread that fed entire civilizations. Now imagine the gentle glow of a fire flickering against the earthen walls of a mud brick oven, the heart of ancient Egyptian baking technology. These ovens were marvels of slow heat and steady warmth built from the very clay and straw that made up village homes. You might picture the baker carefully stoking the embers, adjusting the fire, just enough to create the perfect environment for a slow, even bake. No temperature dials or timers here, just instinct and experience passed down through countless mornings and evenings. These ovens, often dome-shaped or barrel-vaulted, were designed to trap heat efficiently. After heating the interior with a wood or dried dung fire, the embers were swept out, leaving a warm chamber perfect for the dough to rise and bake gently. The mud brick's thick walls absorbed and radiated heat slowly, much like a modern slow cooker, which allowed for a patient, mellow bake that coaxed out complex flavors in the bread's crust and crumb. One quirky detail is that the oven sometimes had small ventilation holes or flues to regulate airflow, showing an early understanding of how to control oxygen to influence the fire's behavior. You might imagine the baker face calm and focused, judging the oven's temperature by touch or the color of the bricks. A subtle art blending observation with tradition. Historians still argue whether these ovens were communal or more often private household features. Some evidence suggests villages might have had shared baking ovens where families took turns baking their daily loaves, turning bread, making into a slow social event. Picture neighbors chatting softly in the early morning light, the smell of baking bread weaving through the air like a gentle invitation to pause and savor simple pleasures. And while the heat was steady, it wasn't always perfectly predictable. Sometimes a bread might bake faster or slower, crusting up in unexpected ways or rising a bit more or less than hoped. This variability was part of the charm and challenge of ancient baking, where patience and flexibility were key. Bakers learned to read these subtle signs, adjusting firewood amounts or timing their dough preparation accordingly. So next time you think about ovens, remember these humble clay structures, silent patient workers in a world without rush, quietly nurturing the loaves that sustained ancient Egypt. Bread baking in ancient Egypt wasn't a solitary chore. It was a gently social affair woven into the fabric of village life. Imagine a morning where women and bakers gather near the communal oven, their voices low and steady, exchanging quiet conversation amid the rhythmic kneading of dough. This was more than just food preparation. It was a shared ritual that connected individuals to their neighbors and their community in a way that felt comforting and natural. The process unfolded slowly, matching the unhurried pace of the day. While some bakers worked on their loaves, others might tend to children playing nearby or prepare other parts of the family's meal. The gentle bustle around the oven created a soft soundtrack of life. The scrape of wooden bowls, the slap of dough being shaped, the occasional laughter that softened the early morning stillness. There was a natural division of labor, but no sharp boundaries. Often, the expertise rested with women who had learned from their mothers and grandmothers, passing down knowledge not just of recipes, but of timing, texture, and technique. Bakers weren't just food producers, they were keepers of tradition, storytellers through the tactile language of dough. Some bakers were even part of guild-like groups in larger towns, further emphasizing the communal nature of the craft. You might be amused to know that in some cases baking became an excuse for gentle gossip or sharing news. There's a soft humor in imagining ancient bakers exchanging whispered jokes about who burnt their bread last week or the new village gossip, just like you might overhear today in a cozy kitchen. Historians still argue whether baking was mostly confined to the home or if professional bakers dominated the process in cities, but either way, the communal aspect remained strong. In smaller villages, ovens could be shared spaces with families taking turns or baking in batches, fostering a quiet cooperation that strengthened social bonds. So, as you imagine these scenes, picture the soft warmth of the oven balanced by warm human connection, a reminder that even in the simplest tasks, people found moments of belonging and comfort kneading their stories gently into the very bread they made. Bread was more than mere sustenance in ancient Egypt. It carried layers of spiritual meaning and symbolism, woven deeply into the culture's daily life and religious rituals. Picture a quiet temple morning where priests prepare offerings not just of grain or wine, but of freshly baked bread carefully shaped and arranged as gifts to the gods. Bread was a sacred link between the mortal and divine, a humble yet vital element in ceremonies that sought to maintain balance and favor from the deities. In temples, special loaves were crafted with particular care, sometimes shaped into intricate forms resembling animals, symbols, or even human figures. These symbolic breads weren't meant to be eaten, but rather served as offerings to nourish the gods and ensure prosperity. You might find it fascinating that bread shaped like the scarab beetle or the lotus flower could carry rich connotations of rebirth, regeneration, and purity. The importance of bread extended beyond rituals into funerary practices. Tomb paintings and inscriptions often depict bread and beer offerings, alongside other foodstuffs highlighting their role in sustaining the deceased's spirit in the afterlife. It's almost like ancient bakers were quietly baking not just for the living but for eternity, a gentle, comforting thought. Some scholars debate how literally these symbolic breads were made and offered. Were they actual edible loaves crafted for a single ritual use, or more often symbolic representations made of clay or painted reliefs? The evidence is mixed, but either way the cultural weight of bread as a sacred gift is unmistakable. Even everyday bread carried subtle spiritual significance. Grain itself was associated with Osiris, the god of fertility and resurrection, linking the act of baking to the cycles of nature and life. This connection lent a quiet reverence to the daily task of bread making, turning it into a ritual of renewal and hope. So, as you picture those temple kitchens and quiet offerings, imagine the gentle sense of purpose behind every loaf bread, as both nourishment and prayer, a softly whispered promise that lifelike dough rises again. The loaves that came from ancient Egyptian ovens weren't uniform. They varied widely in shape, size, and texture, depending on region, occasion, and available ingredients. Imagine wandering through a bustling market where bread sellers display a variety of loaves, some round and dense, others long and slender, each carrying its own gentle story. One common form was the simple round loaf, often with a rough rustic crust and a chewy crumb. These were everyday breads designed for practicality and ease of sharing. Then there were oblong loaves, sometimes stamped with symbolic designs, or the baker's mark, which served special purposes or festivals. You might find it charming that certain shapes were thought to influence the bread's texture or baking time, much like today's bakers choose pans to shape their loaves. Texture varied too. Some breads were coarse and hearty, full of bran, and bits of grain perfect for dipping in stews or sauces. Others were finer, perhaps reserved for wealthier households or temple offerings. Historians still argue how much regional variation existed, whether a loaf from Thebes would be noticeably different from one baked closer to Memphis or Alexandria. But the diversity certainly reflected the richness of Egypt's cultural and agricultural landscape. In some areas, bakers experimented with mixing in ingredients like dates, figs, or herbs, subtly shifting flavors and adding moisture. This practice hints at a playful curiosity among bakers, a desire to gently innovate within tradition. You might imagine the scent of fragrant herbs mingling with warm bread, a sensory detail that brings ancient kitchens to life. Different shapes also had practical reasons. Larger loaves could feed a family over several meals, while smaller rolls were handy for individual portions or travel. These choices reflected not only culinary preferences, but the rhythms of daily life when and how bread was consumed, stored, and shared. So, as you picture those warm loaves cooling on woven mats, consider the quiet variety behind what might seem a simple staple. Each shape and texture tells a story, a soft whisper of place, purpose, and care baked into the crust. Now, let's turn our gaze to the bakers themselves, the skilled individuals whose hands transformed humble grain into the life-sustaining bread of ancient Egypt. You might picture them as quiet artisans, their fingers dusted with flour, moving with practiced ease through each step of the process. But who were these bakers? Were they men, women, or perhaps both? And what place did they hold in the social fabric of their communities? In many households, baking was primarily the domain of women. passed down through generations as a vital domestic skill. Women often juggled this with other duties, caring for children, managing household chores, making bread baking a steady, comforting rhythm in daily life. Their expertise was not just practical, but deeply intuitive, tuned to the subtle cues of dough texture and oven warmth. However, in larger towns and cities, specialized bakers emerged, sometimes organized into guilds or professional groups. These bakers might have been men or women depending on the time and place, and often held a respected position due to their essential role. Some were attached to temples or royal households, tasked with producing bread offerings for gods or pharaohs, elevating their craft into a sacred duty. An intriguing detail is that certain titles and inscriptions refer to breadmasters or breadwomen, suggesting a formal recognition of the craft. These bakers weren't just cooks, they were artisans and crucial cogs in the economy and culture. They managed supplies, trained apprentices, and maintained starter cultures with care and precision. Historians still argue about the exact gender balance and social standing of bakers, partly because much of the evidence comes from tomb inscriptions or temple reliefs emphasizing elite contexts. But the consensus leans toward a complex picture, baking as a family-centered skill at the domestic level, and a more formalized profession in urban centers. Imagine a baker's daily life: the steady flow of tasks, the tactile pleasure of kneading dough, the quiet satisfaction of a well-baked loaf. It's a gentle reminder that behind every ancient civilization were countless individuals shaping the mundane yet vital acts that kept the world turning. You might be surprised to learn that ancient Egyptian bakers sometimes added unusual ingredients to their dough, turning simple bread into a subtle flavor adventure. While the basic recipe was just flour, water, and starter, the inclusion of things like dates, herbs, and even beer hints at a creativity and culinary curiosity often overlooked in discussions about ancient diets. Dates were a popular sweetener, chopped finely and mixed into dough to add moisture and a gentle caramel-like sweetness. Imagine biting into a loaf where the soft chew of bread mingles with sticky bursts of fruit, an unexpected treat after a long day of labor. Herbs such as coriander and cumin were also sometimes included, lending delicate aromatic notes that would have filled the kitchen with a calming earthy scent. One quirky addition that occasionally appears in records is beer. Yes, beer, not as a drink, but as an ingredient. Since beer was a staple beverage, its yeast-rich liquid was sometimes mixed into dough to enhance fermentation or flavor. You might chuckle imagining a slightly tipsy loaf rising merrily in the oven, thanks to its bubbly companion. This practice blurs the lines between baking and brewing in a way modern cooks rarely explore. Historians still argue about how widespread and common these odd additives really were. Some suggest they were reserved for special occasions or wealthier households, while others think they were more typical than we realize. The evidence comes from a mix of ancient texts, residue analysis on pottery, and artistic depictions, all pieced together like a slow, delicious puzzle. The inclusion of these ingredients reflects the Egyptians' nuanced relationship with food, not just as fuel, but as comfort, culture, and even pleasure. It's easy to imagine the soft laughter and experimentation behind these recipes, a quiet rebellion against blandness in a world defined by rhythm and routine. So next time you savor a slice of fruity or herbed bread, think back to those ancient bakers mixing their dough with whatever the Nile and their pantries provided, adding little surprises to the everyday. Imagine the challenge of keeping fresh bread in the hot, dry climate of ancient Egypt, a place where the sun baked the earth and humidity was scarce. Preservation wasn't just a convenience, it was a necessity. Bakers and households developed gentle techniques to keep their loaves from turning stale or too hard under the relentless desert sun. One common method was careful storage. Bread was often kept in baskets lined with cloth or in ceramic containers with lids that allowed just enough air circulation to prevent mold but kept out dust and pests. You might picture these storage vessels as simple yet elegant, decorated with subtle patterns, and designed to balance protection and breathability. Another trick was to bake smaller loaves intended to be eaten quickly, reducing the need for long storage. Larger, denser loaves, on the other hand, could be dried out intentionally, essentially turned into early versions of hardtack or twice-baked bread. These dried breads lasted longer and were ideal for travelers or workers spending long hours away from home. Interestingly, bread crust itself acted as a natural barrier against staleness. Bakers learned to coax a thick, well-formed crust that sealed the crumb inside, slowing moisture loss. The slow, steady heat of the mud brick ovens helped develop this crust, gently creating a kind of protective shell. Historians still argue about whether ancient Egyptians used any natural preservatives like honey or salt in their bread to extend freshness. Some texts mention sweeteners and additives, but don't clarify if they helped preservation or just flavor. The precise methods remain a bit of a mystery, but it's clear that the art of storing bread was as important as baking it. Imagine the daily ritual of checking bread baskets, smelling for freshness, and breaking off just enough loaf to accompany a meal. This careful stewardship of bread reflects a deep appreciation not just for its nourishment, but for the comfort and security it provided amid the shifting sands and sun. As the sun sets beyond the Nile, the ancient Egyptians' relationship with bread takes on a spiritual dimension extending far beyond the kitchen and into the realm of the afterlife. Picture a quiet tomb chamber, its walls painted with scenes of daily life, including offerings of bread and beer laid carefully before the departed. Bread wasn't just food for the living, it was a vital provision for the soul's journey beyond death. The belief was that the spirit or Kai needed sustenance in the afterlife to maintain its vitality and happiness. Fresh bread offerings symbolized ongoing nourishment, a gentle reassurance that the deceased would not go hungry in the next world. Some tombs even include depictions of bread loaves stacked high, suggesting the importance of abundance and generosity. You might find it fascinating that specific types of bread were chosen for these offerings, often shaped or decorated to signify their sacred purpose. Inscriptions sometimes accompanied the bread images, invoking blessings or prayers for the deceased's comfort. This practice highlights the bread's role as a bridge between earthly life and spiritual continuity. Historians still argue about the extent to which these offerings were literal versus symbolic. Did families regularly bake fresh bread for tomb rituals, or were painted representations sufficient? The answer likely varies by period and social status, but the underlying belief in bread's afterlife importance remained consistent. Beyond tombs, bread also featured in funerary feasts and rituals intended to honor ancestors and maintain cosmic order. These events were gentle celebrations of life's cycle, where bread served as both gift and remembrance, softening the boundary between past and present. So, as you imagine the quiet flicker of candles in an ancient tomb and the scent of bread offerings mingling with incense, think of the tender hope baked into each loaf, that life's warmth and sustenance will endure, softly rising beyond death's quiet. Picture dusty digs and quiet museums where archaeologists unearth the tools and remnants of ancient Egyptian baking, a treasure trove of clues about this slow, essential craft. Pottery fragments shaped like bread molds, carbonized crumbs tucked inside tombs, and worn grinding stones all whisper secrets of daily life long past. Some of the most fascinating finds are preserved loaves, carbonized by the fires that once baked them. These fossilized crumbs reveal textures and ingredients, offering rare glimpses into recipes. For example, analysis of these ancient crumbs has uncovered traces of barley and emmer wheat, confirming what texts have long suggested about staple grains. Baking tools recovered from sites range from simple hand mills to elaborate ovens, showing a gradual evolution of techniques. One quirky discovery includes ceramic bread stamps, which may have been used to mark loaves for temple offerings or to signify ownership. Imagine a baker gently pressing a symbol into soft dough, leaving a silent signature that echoes across millennia. Historians still argue how standardized baking was, whether ancient Egypt had official bakeries churning out uniform loaves for palace and temple needs, or if most baking was still a household affair with great local variation. The evidence is a patchwork, with urban centers showing more formalized production and rural areas likely favoring simpler methods. Interestingly, these archaeological finds also highlight how baking connected social and spiritual realms. Tools found in temple complexes point to the sacred status of bread making, while everyday tools from homes reveal the practical side of this art. It's a gentle reminder that ancient Egyptian bread was both a humble staple and a cultural cornerstone. So as you trace the worn edges of a grinding stone or the faint imprint of a bread stamp, imagine the quiet hands that crafted these tools, weaving daily life, faith, and nourishment into the very fabric of civilization. Imagine a gentle breeze carrying the scents of fresh bread beyond Egypt's borders, where neighboring cultures caught a whiff of something special and perhaps a recipe or two. Ancient Egyptian sourdough baking didn't exist in a vacuum. It influenced and intertwined with the bread traditions of surrounding lands, quietly shaping culinary practices across the ancient world. To the west, the Libyans and peoples of the Maghreb developed their own versions of flatbreads and sourdoughs, likely inspired by trade and interaction with Nile Valley neighbors. In the east, the Levantine cultures incorporated aspects of Egyptian bread making, adapting them to their grains and ovens. Imagine caravans bearing not only goods, but also the knowledge of fermentation and baking techniques, an ancient version of culinary exchange. Historians still argue about the precise roots and timing of these influences. Was Egyptian sourdough the direct ancestor of Mediterranean breads, or did similar techniques evolve independently in different regions? The debate is lively, but underscores the interconnectedness of ancient foodways. One quirky example comes from Mesopotamia, where records mention beer bread, a fermented loaf that shares characteristics with Egyptian sourdough, suggesting a shared or parallel tradition. It's charming to think of bakers in distant lands tinkering with their starters, unaware of their counterparts along the Nile doing much the same, united by the gentle magic of fermentation. This cross-cultural baking dialogue reminds us that even in ancient times, food was a subtle connector, softening borders and building relationships one loaf at a time. The slow, careful art of sourdough, nurtured by ancient Egyptians, quietly spread its warmth and flavor far beyond its origins. So, as you picture the mingling of cultures around a shared love of bread, think of the ancient bakers as unintentional ambassadors, their humble loaves carrying stories and traditions across deserts and seas. As the long history of ancient Egyptian baking gently fades into modern times, you begin to see how the quiet art of sourdough has left a subtle yet lasting imprint on today's bread traditions. The slow, patient methods developed by those early bakers, capturing wild yeasts, nurturing starters. Baking in simple clay ovens echo softly in artisanal bakeries around the world. Consider the modern sourdough craze with its emphasis on natural fermentation, complex flavors, and hands-on craft. Though centuries and continents separate us from the Nile Valley, the core principles remain remarkably similar. You might find it soothing to think that the dough you mix today carries within it the legacy of ancient bakers who patiently coaxed life from grain and water. Historians still argue about how directly modern sourdough techniques trace back to Egypt, given the many influences and parallel developments across cultures. But the essence, a slow, mindful process attuned to natural rhythms, feels like a quiet thread weaving past and present together. The humble mud brick ovens, once warmed by gentle fires, find their echoes in today's wood-fired hearths, where bakers listen to the crackle of flames and watch dough rise in warm silence. Even the communal spirit of baking, sharing starters, swapping tips, gathering around ovens, resonates in bakeries and kitchens worldwide. So as you settle deeper into your rest picture, the journey of bread from Nile grain fields to bustling ancient ovens, across time and place all the way to your own quiet kitchen. That slow, nurturing craft continues a soft bridge between generations, a gentle comfort baked into every crust. Now take a deep breath, feel the calm settle around you like warm dough, and let the steady rhythm of this ancient baking lull you towards sleep. And as the story drifts to a close, imagine the sun setting softly over the Nile, casting long golden shadows across fields and villages. The scent of baking bread fades gently into the cool evening air, mingling with the distant calls of night birds and the faint rustle of palm fronds swaying in a quiet breeze. The world slows and you feel a calm settling deep inside, a soft, steady pulse like the heartbeat of ancient kitchens, patient and warm. There's a tenderness in this slow, ongoing dance of life and bread, making a quiet reassurance that even in the simplest acts there is connection and care. The hands that once kneaded dough in the heat of the day have long since rested, but their gentle legacy lingers woven into the fabric of time and memory. So let your thoughts drift like flowers settling on a countertop, soft and light. You are part of this continuum, now connected to those ancient bakers by a shared ritual as old as civilization itself. Rest easy knowing that the slow, steady rise of bread is also the rise of comfort, patience, and quiet joy. Good night and sweet dreams.